opposite. She's delightful. I really love her, but she's very like strict in detail, and he's big picture only.
We had an English faculty member at Warrensburg who was Chinese, and you could barely understand him. So he's teaching English.
That's how Sensei was.
Okay.
It took us a semester to learn.
All right, everybody, we are ready to go. So thank you for joining us for tonight's evening lecture series, first evening lecture series of the 2023-2024 school year. And so thank you for coming out. Our speaker tonight is the one, the only, Colonel Dr. Teddy Bittner. So Dr. Bittner is Chief Academic Officer here at Calvary, Vice President of Academics, Interim PDS Program Director, and Professor of History. You thought you were busy. His professional background includes a Bachelor of Science in Business Administration, a Master of Arts in Christian Ministry, a Master's of Military Art and Science, yes, I had to ask how to say that ahead of time, in Military History, a Doctorate of Ministry in Pastoral Theology, a Diploma in National Strategic Studies, and then most recently, a Doctorate in Education and Higher Education Leadership. He tells us that his favorite aspect of teaching at Calvary is interacting with the students. His favorite class to teach is American military history because he gets to play with guns. And so we are pleased to have him with us tonight presenting his dissertation topic on can transfer students from unaccredited colleges survive at a real college, a real university. And so everyone, please welcome Dr. Teddy Bittner.
Thank you.
Thanks, sir.
Cool. Okay. Well, thanks for coming this evening. Thank you. In the back row, all the way in the back row. There are snacks here provided by the faculty, actually Mary Briggs, and coffee available in the back. So if you can avail yourself of that at any time during the lecture. Just don't throw things up here. Okay? Consume them if you get them. This is my dissertation topic. Actually, that's not the real name, but that's the translated name because it's out of academic language into normal language. Yeah. I did not say dumb down.
No.
Okay. Back for the first 15 years that I was at Calvary, we had a substantial number of transfer students who were from unaccredited institutions. As a matter of fact, and I'll just name Frontier was a really good big source. Cornerstone was a big source of transfer students, and these students were invariably they were superb students. We still get a smattering of them. I believe Cornerstone's closed, but Frontiers, we still get a smattering of Frontier students. We have at least one that I'm aware of right now. So when we had our 2016 Higher Learning Commission visit, a comprehensive visit, one of the comments that they made was about unaccredited transfer students. And we were required to write a report on whether or not our standards were consistent with what other institutions were doing. And I thought, well, there's got to be studies on this. Someone somewhere has got to have looked at whether these students are doing well or not. And in fact, no one, as far as I could tell, still had done that before. So when it came time for a dissertation topic, I shot up a couple. I got shot down on a couple. And so I put this one forward because no one had done it before, and they bought it. So this became my dissertation topic. So I'm going to go through this as I did basically in my defense, a dissertation defense. The way our school worked, it was Aspen University. The way it worked was you had to do, I'll get there in a minute. Okay, you had to do a proposal defense. So that's the first 3 chapters, and the literature review, and then the process, introduction, literature review, and process. And then once they approved that, you had to go to the IRB and get approval for them before we could start the research, which is fairly typical. So what I'm showing you is not any of that, it's the latter portion of the data primarily, although I'm going to cover some of the beginning of it. So the problem statement was a lack of definitive information regarding differences in completion outcomes for unaccredited and accredited transfer students. Is there a difference in outcomes for them? And differences in completion outcomes for unaccredited students transferring to institutions with different transfer credit policies. And I'll explain that a bit more. Okay, so within the academic world, there is this microcosm of people who are enthralled by student transfer research. Okay, and I discovered them in my literature review. And so we're going to have to talk about them a little bit. The current focus is on vertical transfer, and that's from 2-year institutions to 4-year institutions. And what people are trying to do is figure out what factors would encourage students to go from 2 to 4 years. And so the transfer rate is what they're looking at. And so they're trying to figure out how they make that better. Having said that, there's a lot of 2-year students who don't want to go to 4-year institutions. So, you have to, governments don't realize or recognize that very well. So this is an issue that they're not dealing with, as far as I can tell. Ever since 2017, and I started my dissertation process in 2020. Ever since 2017, there's been a greater degree of granularity in looking at the outcomes. Up until that time, it was very gross. All they really looked at was transfer percent. That was what everyone focused on. And they didn't look at the reasons why there was differences very much, really. They started messing with it around the 2010 timeframe. So beginning in 2017, their studies began to emerge that were much more fine levels of differences. Lack of definitive research in faith-based unaccredited transfer policies, there was 0. I actually found one unaccredited transfer study that was done as a master's thesis in the 1970s. But it was lacking a lot of stuff, including statistical analysis. So that was a Ball State, I believe, university. So what this does is contributes to ABHE's understanding of transfer policies, ABHE being Association of Biblical Higher Education, one of our accrediting agencies, not the one that did the visit. This is a different one. And institutional understanding policy blends. What policies might we have that would encourage transfer students from unaccredited institutions and be selective enough to ensure that it would be likely for them to succeed? So I had 4 research questions I went with, and this is a quantitative analysis. It's not qualitative. Pure statistical analysis, okay? That's important going into this. Is there a difference in completion rates between students who transfer to an institution with unaccredited credits and students who transfer with accredited credits? Okay, so the first thing is completion rates between accredited and unaccredited students. Number 2, is there a difference in time to complete a 4-year degree between students who transfer to an institution with unaccredited credits and students who transfer with accredited credits? How long does it take for them to finish? And the definition here is the first day they walk into a door in a college to the day they walk across the stage, how many months is that? Okay, and the months will be defined. This is based on a model which I'll talk about in just a minute. Research question 3, is there a difference in completion rates between unaccredited transfer students who transfer to an institution employing transfer policy A and transfer policy B? Transfer policy A is actually Emmaus Bible College. Transfer policy B is actually Calvary Bible College. Okay? Those are the 2 institutions who had 2 different sets of transfer policies, which I'll talk about a little bit later. Okay? Research question 4, is there a difference in time to complete a 4-year degree between transfer policy A and transfer policy B? So we're looking at the same outcome type, but with a different measurement. So any questions about that at all? Everyone got this? Okay, good. The lit review. So in the literature review, of course, when we do a quantitative analysis, it has to be based on a theory. Okay, so I had kind of got the structure before I got the theory. So then I went on a search, which took about 2 months. Like, what is the basis of this model I'm going to use? And eventually, I kicked the rock over where the answer was, and that was the human capital theory, which I'd never heard of before. And we'll talk about that. Then associated with that, human capital theory is big. A smaller portion of the human capital theory is a transfer student capital theory. And then a smaller portion of that is the theory of articulation effectiveness, which is actually not a theory, it's a model that I employed to do the analysis with. Also topic rationale and theoretical links. So I had to find literature with respect to linkage between the topic and the theory. And then related studies, specific related studies that have been done in the past in this area to include student types and student outcomes, transfer policies and student outcomes, unaccredited institutions and student outcomes. I found a couple. I found 2. One was in Colombia, South America. The other one was a Ball State one. And then I found a whole bunch of studies that were done from institutions where there was accredited institutions, but their business program was not accredited, or their counseling program was not accredited, or whatever. So comparing those types, EMT programs, and so then they were measuring success by first-time pass rates, or education programs, for example. That's what I found, which is not exactly the same thing, but it's as close as I could get. Unaccredited transfer guidelines. What are the guidelines that we work under? That went to ABHE. So we were following the ABHE's guidelines because HLC didn't have any. Even though they wrote us up, they didn't have guidelines. Okay? ABHE does. So I went to them as a source of this. And then the methodological framework. So I had to talk about how the methodological framework works in the application I'm using here, even though it was unrelated, the subject matter was unrelated to anything about what I was doing. Okay, so the framework, the human capital theory. Has anyone ever heard of this before? You have? Okay. So Schultz and Becker, they were both at the Chicago School of Economics. They both received Nobel Prizes in economics for work on the human capital theory separately. So Becker first and then Schultz second. I'm sorry, Schultz first and then Becker second. So it's based on the concept of a free market economy. In case you don't know, the Chicago School of Economics is a free market school. It's based on the Austrian model, what was called Reaganomics back in the 80s, or supply side economics back in the 80s. And it's a view that allow it to run on its own. The capitalist approach is the most efficient and effective. When you start messing with it, things fall apart. Okay, so that's kind of the basis there. That's a very crude description. However, they concluded that, and this is in the aftermath of World War II. They concluded that Schultz started out with this, that human capital exists to enhance physical capital, money, buildings, stuff. And if you invest in developing humans, like through education, then they'll be more productive. And the more productive they are, the more it betters society. And it just feeds on itself. So the theory was, if you invest in education with government funds, it will help productivity overall. It may take time for that to happen, but it's going to be a better society and a better economy if that in fact occurs. So that was the basis, the foundation of what Schultz wrote about. So investment in higher education improves society across the board, not only monetarily, but socially as well. This is assuming, of course, the education is not indoctrination. Okay. Becker followed on. Investment in education is investment in human capital, relationships between higher education and higher learning. So he did some studies on that issue and published. This theory was adopted by U.S. policymakers in the aftermath of the GI Bill in the 40s, with pouring money into higher education in the 50s and 60s. Okay, so any questions about that? Okay, so that's the overall overarching theory. You may ask, well, how did that relate to what we're doing? I'll get there eventually. Okay, so a smaller subset of that is this transfer student capital concept. What these guys were looking at, this is Lunnan and Stirobin, they were looking at students who were disadvantaged, trying to figure out how to have better outcomes for them educationally. So what things, they were messing with issues or things or pulling strings, trying to figure out how to make better outcomes by varying inputs, okay? So they came up with this theory. Transfer pathways offer opportunity to improve educational opportunities. So what is the best pathway? How can we, someone who's disadvantaged and who may not have had English in high school that was any good, how do we help them succeed in that situation? Outcomes, so they're looking at outcomes, they're looking at higher education opportunities, social mobility, and especially women and minorities and the impoverished. That was where their focus was at. Okay, so they're looking at transfer and outcome things. Then Roxa and Keith. Roxa was originally from Bosnia, so I have an affinity for her based on the time I spent there. I was there for 2 years. During the war and then during the peace. And then Keith was a professor at West Point. Okay, so what they were looking at was, they said, okay, you guys, all you researchers out there have been looking at transfer rates from 2-year to 4-year schools. That's not what you should be looking at. What you should be looking at is 4-year outcomes. Students succeeding at the end of a 4-year program. So you're focusing on this, you should be focusing on that. And they came up with a model. And they looked at 3 outcomes. 1 was completion rates, 2 was time to complete, and 3 was how many hours was a student able to transfer from a 2-year school to a 4-year school. And the more they could transfer, the better off they would be. This is the theory. They looked at policies from all the states of the United States to try to determine which policies were being done internally within the state systems, from community colleges to state schools, and then measuring those outcomes to see what policy set was best. They could not find an answer. There was not statistically significant evidence available at the time that they did their study. However, their model was perfect for what I wanted to do. So I thought, this is it. And then I drove that back to the human capital theory, which is what it's based on originally. So they were looking at articulation agreements. Articulations should result in credit preservation for transfer students. So if you have credits, you don't lose them when you transfer. And employee student outcomes is a measure of effectiveness, and those are the 3 outcomes I just mentioned. Okay. Any questions on that? So Roxa and Keith provided me the model. I could use 2 of the 3. I could do completion rates and months to complete. I couldn't do credit transfers because of one of the ABHE policy school limitations, which impacted that, which is coming up. Okay, so ABHE. The ABHE standards or guidelines for unaccredited transfer student transfers, first, there are things you can do to ensure that students coming in are competent. Okay? One is to give them exams to measure how much they know about what they're supposed to know when they completed the classes on their transcript. Secondly, look at the syllabi and the faculty qualifications. Does that indicate there's rigor in the courses? Number 3, historic experience with the institution. If we have a relationship with that institution and we know that the students that are coming from there, the grades that they're getting are good, we know that that's a good measure of what they're able to do. And 4, successful completion of a specific academic criteria at the receiving institution. In other words, placing credits in escrow until such time the student has demonstrated that he or she is capable of surviving at a college accredited at our institution. These were the guidelines from ABHE, but schools were not limited to those guidelines. They could add other things. Okay? So way back in 2016, after our visit, I looked at all of the ABHE schools in the United States that were regionally accredited, both the Higher Learning Commission, like us, and then other regional agencies. And I looked at all of their policies. And what I found was that the policies broke into 3 categories. First policy was a school that used this escrow thing right here, okay, or that limited the number of hours you could transfer in, for example, 24, or that didn't use a limitation and just used these 3 right here. Those were the 3 categories. Okay, so now I have categories of ABHE school practices that ABHE seems to be okay with. We fell into one of those categories, and that was faculty review, syllabus review, and we did a escrow. We placed credits in escrow until the students demonstrated the capability to succeed at a higher level class in general ed, biblical ed, and their major before we would allow those credits to transfer in. So that was our policy going into this process. The other school was Emmaus. They limited the number of hours to 24. So they were in that category, that grouping. We were in this grouping. So those are 2 groupings with different policies. Okay, so I did a quantitative study, a statistical analysis of student outcomes as a measure of transfer policy effectiveness based on Roxa and Keith's model. This is a causal comparative methodology. So there's a specific methodology that is a statistical standard process called causal comparative, and that includes independent variables that are not manipulated. So this is not an experimentation-based operation. So you have variables that are not manipulated. You have categorical independent variables and continuous dependent variables. So categorical means there's categories, not numbers. But the dependent variable is continuous numbers. Okay, so that's where the statistics come in at. I use a 2x2 factorial design running ANOVAs. ANOVAs are analysis of variances. So are you familiar with ANOVAs and t-tests? Sort of, okay. So an ANOVA is a complex t-test where it analyzes means, averages in a very sophisticated format. Okay, the methodology then. So I have 2 ANOVAs I ran. The first one is, this is the independent variable here, student type, with 2 levels, accredited and unaccredited. Another independent variable of transfer policy type, this is actually Emmaus and Calvary. This is the percent of the degree completion for each student. So this is the dependent variable, which is a continuous number. So because I had to have a continuous number, what I did was, the data collection process was that we went through the records here. I did actually went through the records at Calvary, and this is after IRB approval, of course. And the registrar at Emmaus pulled all the data for me. I sent them a spreadsheet, and they populated it. Okay. So on the spreadsheet, we had columns, which is going to show up here in a minute, and then there were lines for each column with all the data filled in. Okay. So we had to go through every student record from fall of 2010 to fall of 2015. So during that period of time, because the policies were stable, there was no changes in policies from the fall of 2010 to the fall of 2015. We changed our policy in the spring of 2016, so that was the cutoff date. Okay. Okay. So what this was the number of hours a student completed here versus the number of hours required for the program. So a ministry studies student requires 126 hours to graduate. If they completed the program, it's 100%. If they only completed 90 hours of the program and they quit and left, well, that's 90 out of 126, whatever that percent is. 90 of 120, 75%. So it's something around that area. So that's the number that went on the spreadsheet. Okay. So right here, we would have this percentage associated with an accredited student from Emmaus and an accredited student from Calvary, unaccredited student from Emmaus, and unaccredited student from Calvary. Those are the numbers that went in a much longer format that went into the software package. So this is for completion. The second one was time to complete. It's the same format, except now we're looking at months to complete. How many months did it take from start to finish the program? Okay, any questions on that? Everyone's got it. So I was dealing with a dissertation committee that was used to qualitative analysis. So, but they got it. So then they told me, yeah, we understood what you did. So well, I'm glad. Variables. So we have independent variables and dependent variables. The independent variables, student type at 2 levels, which you saw already right here, and then transfer policy type at 2 levels, which you saw right here. Policy A, Emmaus, policy B is Calvary. And those were the policies I mentioned earlier. The dependent variable is completion statistic, percent of degree completed based on semester hours, and then the total months to complete a 4-year degree. Those are the variables. Okay, so transfer policy, and I mentioned this already. Emmaus, syllabi quality, faculty qualifications, 24-hour cap on transferring credits. So if you're a Frontier student with 90 hours and you went to Emmaus, you lost a bunch in the process. Transfer policy B, syllabi quality, faculty qualifications, and escrow. So credits were placed in escrow and held there until the students demonstrated the capability to survive here, and then they were placed on the transcript. Okay. So those are the two. That's the difference there. And what they criticized us for was we were too generous in allowing student hours. So population and sample. I use a convenience sample. For those of you who do this kind of thing, you know what that is. It's a convenience. It's what's there, as opposed to doing random selection of individuals. Historical data from the registrar's office. So we took the data from Emmaus's registrar office and Calvary's registrar's office. That's the data we used. 2 institutions employing 2 transfer policies, A and B, transfer students from fall of 2010 to fall of 2015. I mentioned I did a G-power calculation to yield the minimum sample size that's required for statistical viability, and that was 125 students. So I had to have at least 125 students in the sample for this to work. Instrumentation, Excel spreadsheet. This is high-speed, amazing technical stuff, okay? So big Excel spreadsheets. So institution generated anonymous identification number because these had to be anonymous. Transfer dates, what date did they come in? Transfer type, they're accredited or unaccredited. Transfer hours, GPA, transfer GPA. Then you can see I'm asking for more data that's in the ANOVAs, which I'm glad I did for a reason I'll show you in a minute. Hours completed toward the degree, I had to have that. And then how many hours did it take to complete the degree? I had to have that too. So I had to go through every transcript, had to go through every student application, every student's transcript, and figure out when they started, how many hours they got, and what they ended with for every one of them. So it took a while. Cumulative GPA, so what they ended with in terms of their GPA, how long it took them to complete was calculated automatically in Excel. Start date, end date, and set it up so it automatically calculates the months. And then demographic data, age, gender, and ethnicity. Okay. So any questions on the instrumentation? Yes?
So you registered the total hours, the total GPA. Did either school, did they take into account testing in for anything, and was that part of the?
No, I only took what was on the transcript.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Other questions? Good question. Okay, so I employed a 2x2 factorial design, and the layout you saw earlier with the squares, that's a 2x2 factorial design for a causal comparative study, specifically. Used SAS version 9.4.2 for statistical analysis. I hired a statistician, someone who has many journal articles under his belt where he's done the statistics. Chris Basil put me onto the guy. I asked him if he knew anyone. He said, oh yeah, this guy we use all the time to get ready for papers that we submit to the FDA. He does our statistical analysis. So he knew what he was doing. And I called him up and he said, yeah, I could do that. It's not a problem. And so that gave it validity for the dissertation committee because it wasn't me doing it. And I didn't know what SAS was. I just knew it was spelled SAS both ways. ANOVA's case 1 to answer our research questions 1 and 3, case 2 for 2 and 4. Significance level is 0.05, which is pretty standard for alpha levels. A p-value, we determine the p-value for statistical, for main and interaction effects for statistical viability, and display ANOVA tables and the effect charts for each calculation. What I got back from him was reams of data, which you didn't have to kind of go through and pick out what you were looking for, because it gives you a whole lot more than you need. Okay, so this is the sample. Can you see the numbers? Mm-hmm. Okay, so there's a total of 414 students in the sample, which is way more than what I needed. For Emmaus, it's 136. For Calvary, it's 278. So we obviously take in a lot more transfer students than they did during this time frame. You can see the breakout, male, female, accredited, unaccredited. And you can see right here it's only 9 students. That is an issue which rears its ugly head a little bit later on. For mean ages, the mean age at transfer for Emmaus is 20.69. For Calvary is 27.74. Why is there a huge difference in age? Do you happen to know, Dr. Paxton? Putting you on the spot just briefly.
And why there's a big difference in age
between
of
Emmaus
students coming in?
Yeah. 2010 to 2015, the time frame is important. We had a degree completion program.
Oh, Excel.
Excel.
Oh, yes.
So we have students who transferred in who
Yes.
took breaks and were older. Okay, so that's what I saw the numbers. It's like,
Yeah.
really,
Totally.
yeah. And the reason I'm showing that on this chart is because it becomes an issue later. Okay, so case 1, case 2. So case 2 is a smaller number, 222, because case 2 looks at people who graduated. Case 1 are the transfer-ins, case 2 are the graduates. Okay, so here we have 84 and 138. The ages, however, case 1, 2069, 2039, virtually identical. Case 1, 27.74, 26.74, virtually identical. Very, very close. So there's a lot of consistency here in these numbers. Okay, the analysis, the outcome. This is research questions 1 and 3, case 1. Both of these questions deal with completion rates. What percent of the program did each individual student complete? Okay, for accredited students, transfer policy A, which is Emmaus, is 79%. B is 68.9%. Unaccredited students for Emmaus is 88.9, and Calvary is 83.9. Okay, so we have averages, but does that really tell us anything other than that there's a difference? Okay, so what it tells us is that percent completion based on student type. Based on student type, right here, this is 73.9. Unaccredited students is 86.2. completion rate for unaccredited students was higher for both institutions than for accredited students. How's that for a shock? And it's at this level. It's below 0.05, so it's a significant level of difference. The question 3 deals with the difference between the two institutions. Unaccredited students at Calvary versus unaccredited students at Emmaus, which are these numbers right here. And that difference is not significant. It's way, way above 0.05. So, any questions about that outcome? So Emmaus students were higher than Calvary students in both categories. Unaccredited students were higher than accredited students in both institutions. Okay, so that's completion data. This is months to complete. Emmaus accredited 62.7, unaccredited 60.3. So the unaccredited students got through faster. Calvary 125, 103. These got through faster, but these numbers are way bigger. Why would they be way bigger? Degree completion program. We had one student who graduated in 2016 that started at Bob Jones University in the fall of 1979. Huge time gap. Okay? Whereas the Emmaus students are typical college-age students. They're going directly from one college to another. Ours are going from one college to another college to another college, and then 10 years later came here. Okay? So there's a huge gap there. I had to explain this to my committee.
Would there be a place to maybe go back and look at a completion rate simply from when they started their time at Calvary?
Yeah, I have the data.
Yeah.
It's possible.
Would that help you kind of skip over the gap?
No, but I wasn't interested in doing that, and that wasn't the model I was using. So Roxa and Keith had beginning to end, so that's what I used. Okay, so what is the statistical aspect of this one? So the 93.9 here for accredited students as opposed to the 81.98 here. And of course, the smaller number is better in this case. It's 0.45, so it's not significant. The difference here, 103 to 60, you would think would be hugely significant, right? But it's 0.14. So I called the statistician and I said, okay, so is it possible that the small sample size is affecting this? And he said, absolutely. So what I did as a check on that was I compared this number, and this was already in the data that he gave me, so I didn't have to do anything. It was in the chart. There was a lot, like I said, a lot more than I really needed. But I compared this number right here with this number right here, okay? B to A, because this is close, sort of, and that number was 0.0067. So this is significant, the difference between these numbers. If this were a larger number, clearly this would have been a significant outcome. But it wasn't, so that's, when you do this stuff, that's what you write up. Any questions about that? Alrighty. Okay, so completion rates. Unaccredited students had higher levels of program completion to a significant level than accredited students for both institutions. So, time to complete. Unaccredited students completed faster than their counterparts for both institutions, but not significantly. Completion rates and transfer policies. There wasn't a significant difference from the unaccredited student program completion rates based on transfer policies, and there's no statistical significant difference for unaccredited students' time to complete based on transfer policies. So that was the outcome. However, they still finished faster even though it was not significant, than their accredited counterparts. Any questions about that? Then I obviously had to write up the small sample size in my dissertation. Okay, this is the impact here. This is what the statistician told me, and this is the outcome. Then I went off the map. Not a part of the dissertation. I had the GPA data. And I used another statistical method or a software package called Jamovi. SAS is very expensive. It's very capable. Jamovi is open source, the same exact capability. Okay, so I acquired Jamovi and I ran the GPA, and I did a test on the other data first to see if it matched, and it did. So I got the same results as we got out of SAS. So I ran the GPA data to see what that looked like. So, accredited transfer student, GPA 3.498 for MAS, 3.477 for Calvary. This is fairly close. Unaccredited student, 3.686, 3.713. Again, fairly close. Overall, between student types, accredited versus unaccredited, the difference was 3.7 to 3.48. That's a statistically significant difference between the two. Unaccredited students had higher GPA rates. Here, it was not. This is a very high number, 0.87. So these were very close statistically. And then I did another calculation, and that's the difference between GPA based on transfer policy, and that's MAS students versus Calvary students. Virtually identical numbers in terms of the GPA outcomes for both sets of students in all four quadrants. Questions on that one? Yes?
So that's their GPA after they transfer?
At graduation. At graduation.
So it includes their hours?
Yes.
Okay.
Mary?
Do you think that at their unaccredited school, they were given higher grades than they would have gotten if they had been-
Perhaps, except they got higher grades here too.
Oh,
And this is so close, it's like, you know, it's amazing how close the numbers are between the two institutions in the GPA area.
Would a potential follow-up research be seeing if there's any kind of difference based on the particular school that they're coming from?
Yes, I have that.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
Yes,
okay.
that's an excellent question. Any other questions on the GPA thing? Okay. So, just as a side note, I have Jamovi. It's free. It works like SAS. If you can run Excel, you can run that. So if you ever want to do any statistical analysis, t-tests, ANOVAs, or other things, it's not limited to those. That's something that's free and available. And there's tutorials on YouTube on how to run them. So all you have to do is get the data lined up properly in an Excel spreadsheet, import it, run it. Yeah, it's awesome. It's a lot of fun to play with. So line I did use pre-existing data. I collected historical data to use for the study. You always run the danger of not having a large enough sample size. And I was concerned about that going in because I wasn't sure what numbers we would get out of this process. But we did get enough to actually run the data except for MAS as unaccredited students. The methodology did not address qualitative factors that might be qualitative factors that might affect student outcomes, like campus culture and those kinds of things. The fact that MAS is not in Kansas City, it's at a very small location, whereas we're in a metropolitan area. There's all kinds of factors that were not accounted for in this. There's a finite time frame that may limit a student's completion data. There were students, when I did this, there were students still here that were on that list. They hadn't graduated yet. So I have to go back and look now because I forgot who they are, but if they actually graduated or not. Design does not employ a third dependent variable, and Roxette and Keith, that's the number of credits transferred because of the limitation from Emmaus in that process. Recommendations. So as far as Roxette and Keith's model, add a third variable, and what I did at the time was suggest the GPA. This is before I actually did it, when I was doing my defense. The institutional culture, which I've mentioned. Scope of research, include all three, do a research project where you have all three ABHE types that you're going to compare, okay? Expand institutional categories. In other words, and that's associated with that, so that would come with that. And then do a whole lot more institutions than just two to get a better spread. Demographics, age, gender, and ethnicity. Take a look at how the demographics impact the outcomes. And then institutional origin. Where did the students come from? We drew from Frontier and Cornerstone, very high quality institutions. And the students that came were prepared for college, and they did great. We have students who came from other places that didn't do so well. And you just know that. So that was not a factor in this. Because it was just something I didn't feel was within the scope of what I could do. Practice. So policy mix. That is, what mix of policies are the most effective in student transfer success? Not only in unaccredited, but in general. Transfer pathways. So during the literature review, I identified, and I talk about this in the dissertation, I identified several transfer pathways that were identified and evaluated by various researchers. Unaccredited students was not one of any of them. So my suggestion is that this should be an area of further research, at least within Christian institutions. And like I said, at the time, for 15 years, we had a fairly substantial unaccredited transfer numbers, and you saw that here compared to Emmaus, and that's fallen off. And I think we're missing out by not going back to some specific institutions that we could draw from. So, unaccredited transfer students performed as well or better than their accredited counterparts. So this addresses ABHE's policy mix. Clearly it works. ABHE transfer guidelines appear to be effective. Unaccredited transfer student success. Students employing the accredited transfer pathway succeeded, at least in these cases. And findings were not consistent with the accreditation team's assumptions regarding transfer policies and expected student outcomes from the 2016 HLC visit. They made assumptions which were clearly incorrect. And questions?
So when does that group come back again?
Well, we don't get the same people,
Oh,
but they're going to show up in 25, 26.
and you'll have this documentation from.
Yeah, well, Ian Bacon will. Yeah, Ian will be the one who's answering all the questions.
That doesn't where my heart stops.
Pressure you.
Yeah.
No pressure, no pressure. You'll be done with your doctorate, you'll be all set, you'll be good to go, you'll be in charge. You're going to take my job, right? Yes.
You just walk up and say, here's our chief academic officer dissertation.
Yeah, there you go.
Yes.
Why did more older students come to Calvary and not to Emmaus?
Because Emmaus is in a very small town, relatively small. It's in the tens of thousands small, whereas we're in a metropolitan area.
Okay.
We had a very robust degree completion program, and we had a radio station that advertised it.
Okay.
So we had a lot of students come in here to do degree completion, especially in business. And Skip Hessel was the guy who was here at the time, who facilitated that very effectively. Yep. So, and at the time, the Excel program was very effective. A problem with it was that we had night classes and we had day classes. And the night classes were different in terms of length than the day classes. So we'd have a full semester day class, like Bible study, hermeneutics, but we would have an 8-week night class. So the format was different and you had to teach it differently. Then we had online versions of the same thing. So I was literally teaching one class 3 different ways in the same semester. Okay? So on one hand, Excel was very effective in bringing people in because these are night students, they're working. Okay? On the other hand, it was incredibly labor intensive. If we were doing that now, it'd be a piece of cake. Because we record everything and we can, the students can do the online version if they can't get here. But at the time, we didn't have that capability. We did have online classes, but they were limited, and we were using a third-party vendor to set them up, and it was really painful, very, very painful. You were here then.
Yes, it was
Yes.
very painful.
Knowledge elements. So
It was not fun.
I'm sure they're better now, and they were okay then. Because that's where all of the online stuff was at the time.
But because we had, a contributing factor, I think, because we had the Excel program was specifically marketed in ways that appealed to those students. So we had them come in.
And an interesting factor was the Excel program generated its own culture.
Yeah.
There was this group of students that gelled together, the degree completion students. And they saw themselves more as seminary students than college students because they were older, and they were people who had not done well earlier, and were now coming back a lot more mature and more serious, and they did well because they were focused on it now and they were paying for it themselves as opposed to the parents doing it. So, but it was a good program.
So with that, with the age piece and everything, could you postulate what might it look like today in an incredibly different environment with the blended classroom and everything that's involved?
I can't because this setup, in terms of unaccredited versus accredited, is not nearly as robust as it was then.
Yeah.
So we're drawing from a different group of students now. But with the enrollment cliff coming, we have to go back to degree completion again and to graduate students. Yes.
Well, I'm going to have to go back and make a bunch of apologies because I've for years have argued with those that have come out of or taught at unaccredited institutions, very good ones, historically very good ones. Some went on to get accreditation, some chose not to intentionally. And the reason being was always the methodology was that they would always say that their graduates could pass all the same exams, that's why I asked the question earlier, that an accredited student does. So I'm just wondering, for future research, if you looked at the methodology of those that are successful unaccredited schools,
Yeah.
if the students, because of the methodology of teaching more to the knowledge rather than the grind of credit hours and assignments, if those students are coming in here and they're applying that and finishing quicker because they're more honed in getting the information rather than an accredited student that has learned how to just go through the ropes.
This is all anecdotal, but again, we drew heavily from Frontier. And the Frontier students were always high quality.
Yes.
They were serious, they were focused, they were high quality people, they were engaged, and they intended to succeed. That's the kind of people that tend to go there. Another school, I'm not going to mention the name, we have students who were not motivated,
Right.
who apparently had gone through their academic process up to that point where it was a gift. They slid by and they did not do well here. that school has now become accredited.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's that. I have on for ABHE evaluation, I'm an evaluator. I go to schools. And recently I've done like a series of schools that are becoming accredited that were not. In some cases for decades. Decades and decades of history of working without accreditation. And their academics may be okay, but their processes that's accreditation requires were not. And where they struggled was not in the classroom, it was doing all the stuff that we have to do, like the outcomes assessment page, and all of the seemingly menial tasks that you have to perform that are expected of accredited institutions that they've never had to deal with before. And so it's become, that's where they struggle. It's a shock to their systems, and when they're grappling with all the stuff that goes along with the accreditation process. That's what I've seen. Yeah. I've done a seminary in that case. I've done some undergrad schools recently that have gone through the same process. The seminary was 10 years ago. It just went through reaccreditation, and they're doing really, really well. So they made the transition. Some of these schools don't. I was talking with, at last year's ABHE meeting, this year's ABHE meeting, I was talking to someone from a school who was attempting to make the transition, and they just were not getting there. They couldn't make it happen. So
recognizing that we have such success with unaccredited students coming in and finishing and being successful, how does that, you kind of hinted at this earlier, but how does that help focus our recruitment efforts in building relationships with those particular schools?
I think we need to get back up to Frontier again, specifically. And I've not talked with Chris about this. So this is just getting ready for this evening is like, oh yeah, okay. We need to have a conversation about engaging that school in particular.
2 years, they're only doing 2 years.
Yes, they're doing actually 3.
What's that?
They're doing 3 years at Frontier.
Yeah.
Other questions? And we have an articulation agreement with them. We already have recognized their classes.
Mm-hmm.
So, and we just updated it like 6 months ago.
So I thought you were going to, so there might be some other schools that Calvary should be reaching.
Well, I would be open. There's schools that have become accredited, and Cornerstone, I believe, is closed. So we need to identify some. Yep. Yes.
Does this maybe change your view as well when you are thinking of how you would accept potential graduate students coming out of unaccredited schools?
Yes, and we do.
Farther along?
We do.
Would this give us more impetus to maybe take them?
We do. We actually do take them.
Okay.
Trinity is a good example.
Right.
So we accept Trinity students into our grad programs. Yes.
Yeah.
So there's them. There is now I'm losing it. Schaefer,
Yeah.
which is a good school.
Mhm.
They're not accredited, and there's a couple of others like that as well. So one of the most recent institution I was at, one of the issues they were struggling with was getting people with academic qualifications. So what they had on the faculty were graduates of their own institution with degrees that were not accredited. Yes. So they were working on getting graduate degrees and doctorates in some cases that they needed to have to be able to teach what they were teaching. So they get grace in the process of doing that. The ABHE will say, okay, so we need to see progress here. So when we went to visit this one school, we were looking for where are you now in your process of getting people through accredited degree programs, and they were doing a good job on that. Any other questions?
So can those graduates get jobs at other universities? if they're from an unaccredited?
It depends.